It was 6:15 a.m., and I was standing on my family's 40-acre farm in Montana. The steam from my coffee curled into the chilly air as I watched the sunrise spill golden light across the mountains. Then my phone buzzed. It was a 911 dispatcher. "We've received a report that you're trespassing on private property. You need to leave immediately." I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Honestly, what would you do if someone called the cops on you for standing on land your family had owned for nearly 80 years? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge wallet. "Ma'am, please let the caller know that Deputy Sheriff Ezra Blackwood is right where he belongs." Through the oversized windows of my neighbor's McMansion, I spotted Karen Pitton's face strain pale as snow. Her pricey binoculars still pressed to her eyes like some kind of suburban secret agent. The smell of hay and diesel mingled with the morning fog, and I knew things were about to get interesting. So, what would you do in my shoes? Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I bet some of you have your own home nightmares. But first, let me back up and explain how this all started. My name is Ezra Blackwood, 45 years old. After serving 15 years as a deputy sheriff and going through a rough divorce last spring, I returned to the family farm I inherited from my grandfather. 40 acres of Montana heaven, passed down since 1943 when Grandpa Jeremiah bought it with his G-bill after the war. The old barn still carries the smell of oil and hard work. It's the place where I learned to repair tractors at age 8 and imagine I'd grow old in peace. Then, 5 years ago, Willowbrook Estates sprouted up along my property line, 47 identical McMansions, complete with uniform mailboxes and a rotation of decorative flags. Most of the residents turned out to be decent neighbors. They'd bring their kids over to feed Buttercup, my goat, and buy vegetables from my farm stand. But then there was Karen Pitton. Karen was 52, with salon blonde hair that probably cost more than a car payment each month, a PhD in art history she managed to mention every 5 minutes, and the attitude of someone who thought Renaissance studies made her a lawyer. Her husband Braden owned Pitton Construction, the company that built Willowbrook, and together they lived in the largest house with a lawn so perfect it probably guzzled more water than my whole vegetab. Le Patch. Trouble really began one Tuesday morning in June. I heard the sharp click-click-click of expensive heels on gravel. Karen strutted across my property, waving a manila folder thick as a phone book. Her overpowering perfume even startled my chickens. "Mr. Blackwood," she declared with that grating tone only meant to irritate, "I'm here on official whole business." I wiped my hands on my jeans. "Ma'am, I don't believe I'm part of your whole." Her laugh sputtered like a dead engine. "But you are. When Willowbrook was incorporated, your land was automatically included under our covenants." She shoved a certified letter at me like a summons. "You have 30 days to bring this agricultural situation into compliance." The legal jargon blurred together, but the demands were crystal clear: demolish the barn, remove the chicken coop, shut down the vegetable stand, and move all unsightly farm equipment or face $500 daily fines. My morning coffee instantly turned bitter. Karen stood there, arms crossed, wearing that smug look like she'd just outplayed Bobby Fischer. "Property values depend on aesthetic standards," she went on, though I noticed her eyes flicking over my land with something more than disdain. That hungry expression gave her away. Most of the neighborhood actually liked me and the farm. They'd tell me how much they enjoyed the authenticity I brought to the area. But Karen had rallied a small group convinced my farm was dragging down their perfect community. She even threatened lawsuits when the town council hesitated to back her crusade. That evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains while Buttercup chewed grass nearby. I realized this wasn't about Barnes chickens or zoning rules. Karen's hungry stare, her husband's construction company, it all pointed to something bigger: power, control, land. And I knew right then that a woman who'd call 911 on a deputy sheriff standing on his own property wasn't going to stop at one letter. Sure enough, 3 days later, Karen filed a complaint with the county zoning board, claiming my farm was a public health hazard. She circulated a petition and scraped up 12 signatures from 47 homes. Not exactly overwhelming support, but she posted it on the neighborhood Facebook group as if she'd won a landslide. The photos she shared twisted my clean farm into something out of a disaster zone, shot at angles that made my coop look like it was falling apart. But here's where she slipped. Karen hadn't actually read the HOA's incorporation documents. 15 years in law enforcement had taught me one thing: people rarely check the fine print. So I drove to the county courthouse, dug through old records, and there it was, buried in subsection 12C. Existing agricultural operations shall be permanently exempt from all aesthetic and operational restrictions. Permanently exempt. Two little words that meant her entire case was standing on sand. And I couldn't wait to watch it collapse. To push back, I even requested a health inspection myself. On Thursday, John, a seasoned inspector with 20 years of experience, walked my property, tested the soil, scrutinized the coop, and even checked Buttercup's hooves. When John wrapped up her inspection, she actually chuckled. "Mr. Blackwood, your setup is cleaner than most certified organic farms. I've seen million-dollar operations that don't measure up to this." The victory tasted sweeter than my grandmother's apple pie as I worked on strengthening my legal defense. Something unexpected happened one evening while I was closing the farm stand. Karen's husband Braden approached me. He looked uneasy, constantly glancing over his shoulder toward their house as though afraid Karen might be watching. "Isra," he muttered quietly, "what would it take for you to sell this place? I'm talking 40% above market value, cash, and we'll take care of all the paperwork." 40% above market value for land, supposedly lowering property prices. That offer was far too generous to be about aesthetics. My training as a detective came rushing back. When someone's actions don't line up with their words, follow the money. This wasn't about tidy lawns or resale values. The Pittons wanted my land for a very specific reason and were willing to pay a premium to get it. I shook my head. "Appreciate the offer, Braden, but this farm isn't for sale at any price." His face showed he had expected that response but had been hoping for a different outcome. "Look," he said, lowering his voice further, "between us. Once Karen locks onto an idea," he let the sentence hang, but the warning was clear. The community reaction came fast. The local paper ran a story with the headline, "Deputy's Farm Under Whole Fire." Soon after, neighboring farmers stopped by to lend support. 3 Willowbrook families even retracted their signatures from Karen's petition. With one posting online, "We signed before we fully understood. The Blackwood farm is part of what makes this community unique." That's when my law enforcement instincts fully kicked in. I treated the ordeal like an investigation. Every interaction with Karen got documented, every conversation recorded. Montana is a one-party consent state, a fact I'd used in domestic cases before, and now it worked perfectly for HOA harassment. Every letter, every notice copied and filed. Too many cases had collapsed because of missing evidence, and I wasn't about to let this one slip. Losing community support only made Karen more unhinged. She ramped up her efforts, blasting daily updates online about Willowbrook's supposed agricultural crisis. Her telephoto lens photos made me feel like I was under surveillance. The sound of her heels crunching on my gravel drive became as routine as the morning rooster. Each visit brought a new complaint, new threats, demands that grew more ridiculous by the day. But there was an upside. Those same 3 families who withdrew their support started shopping at my stand often, bringing friends and neighbors who'd never been by. Word spread beyond Willowbrook. There was a farm nearby with the best tomatoes in the county, a place where kids could see where food comes from, and it was run by a deputy sheriff standing up to a bully. By the end of the month, it was obvious Karen had miscalculated. Instead of handling things quietly, she had dragged the fight into the open, in a town that valued honesty, grit, and standing firm. She'd picked the wrong battle and the wrong opponent. Desperation was showing, and desperate people make mistakes. 2 weeks later, she filed a false police report accusing me of threatening her. I was on duty when the call came in. My sergeant looked at me with that "this doesn't add up" expression. "Blackwood, Karen Pitton claims you threatened to deal with her permanently. Care to explain?" I calmly pulled out my phone and played back body cam footage I'd been recording since day one. The video showed Karen doing most of the yelling while I stood with arms folded, asking her politely to leave my property. The harshest thing I'd said was that I'd handle matters through legal channels. Somehow, in Karen's mind, that had morphed into a death threat. My sergeant shook his head and filed it under what we jokingly called the crazy neighbor folder. That same afternoon, animal control arrived after Karen reported dangerous livestock. The officer walked the property, glanced at my 3 docile chickens pecking in their coop, then looked at Buttercup nibbling grass by the fence. He turned to me with a half-smile. "She said you had aggressive animals." I was expecting something with fangs, not a goat trying to make friends with my boot. His official report declared my animals exceptionally tame and no danger whatsoever. But Karen wasn't done. She was saving what she thought was her trump card for next. Karen began parking her BMW directly in front of my farm stand entrance during the busiest hours, insisting she was monitoring traffic safety. The irony. The same woman who complained about traffic was the one creating the bottleneck. My security cameras caught it all: Karen sitting in her luxury car with a clipboard, jotting down license plates like some self-appointed suburban surveillance agent. Occasionally she'd step out to lecture families about supporting a so-called agricultural nuisance that she claimed as lowering property values. From my years dealing with domestic disputes, I knew one thing for certain: solid documentation always outperforms heated confrontation. Instead of giving Karen the public shouting match she was clearly itching for, I filed harassment and obstruction complaints, backed by timestamp photos and video footage. Every exchange was recorded. Every incident was reported. I was building a case file any prosecutor would be thrilled to have. Her false police report ended up blowing up in her face. My fellow deputies couldn't resist cracking jokes about my dangerous farm, and even the sheriff stopped by in person to buy tomatoes, making sure to comment loud enough for everyone to hear on how calm and well kept the farm was. The following week, Karen called dispatch again, this time accusing me of aggressive fertilizing at 6 in the morning. Dispatch put her on hold before gently explaining that farming wasn't against the law. While Karen was busy undermining her own credibility, I was digging into public records. My gut kept circling back to Braden's overly generous cash offer. Sure enough, the county planning office revealed preliminary blueprints for a luxury subdivision expansion including my 40 acres, filed 6 months before Karen lodged her first complaint. This wasn't random ho nonsense. It was a calculated move to push me off land they needed for their next big project. The community's reaction gave me hope. Once word spread about Karen's driveway blocking tactics, 3 local veterans began showing up with lawn chairs and thermoses, stationing themselves at my entrance to make sure customers had easy access. They weren't there to intimidate anyone, just to be a friendly presence, and Karen clearly hated it. My favorite moment came courtesy of Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher from Willowbrook who had no tolerance for foolishness. She strolled up to Karen's BMW during one of her stakeouts and said in that sharp, no-nonsense teacher voice, "Excuse me, dear, but you're blocking access to the best tomatoes in 3 counties. Either buy something or move along." The look on Karen's face, realizing her own neighbors were siding against her, made every bit of harassment worth it. Ironically, her campaign against me turned my quiet little farm into one of the county's most popular weekend spots. People drove in from nearby towns just to buy produce from the deputy sheriff standing up to HOA bullies. What began as Karen's attempt to ruin my livelihood had become the best advertising I could have dreamed of. But I wasn't naive. Karen's behavior was getting wilder, more reckless, and people backed into a corner tend to make catastrophic mistakes. The only question was how far she'd push things before crossing a line she couldn't walk back from. The scent of diesel from my tractor and her overpowering perfume during our run-ins had become as routine as my morning coffee, and I suspected both would linger for a while. By the 3rd month, Karen escalated again. This time, she brought in reinforcements: Harrison Kemp, a high-priced attorney from the state capital who specialized in property value protection, and Char. Get $500 an hour. Their big move. A civil lawsuit claiming my farm had slashed Willowbrook's property values by $200,000. With an emergency injunction demanding I shut down all farming activity immediately. It was legal intimidation at its finest, an attempt to drown me in costs until I gave up and sold. But what Kemp didn't realize was that I'd been preparing my own defenses. My ex, Sarah, now a prosecutor, was quietly feeding me insights about his firm's strategies over coffee one morning. "Ezra," she said, this guy has run the same play in at least 4 counties. He counts on people being too broke to fight back. But I wasn't broke. I had something more valuable than money, airtight documentation, and a gut feeling this was bigger than just one unhinged neighbor. My detective instincts told me Karen's obsession wasn't about property values at all. So, followed the money trail, the same way I'd once tracked narcotics networks. What I uncovered shifted the entire picture. Pitt and Construction had been using identical strong-arm tactics against rural property owners in 3 neighboring counties over the last 5 years. The pattern never changed: target land near a planned development, weaponize the HOA to pressure owners into selling cheap, then transfer the properties through shell corporations for enormous profits. Every single landowner ended up losing their family property for a fraction of its true worth. When I took my findings to the district attorney's office, their interest was immediate. They'd already been fielding complaints about Pitt and Construction but hadn't pieced it all together until I showed up with 5 years of documented harassment cases. The DA spread my files across her conference table and said flatly, "This isn't a neighbor spat. This is orchestrated fraud, and you've brought us the receipts." Meanwhile, Karen was spiraling. She started creeping along the property line at midnight with a flashlight, snapping photos of customers' license plates, and lodging complaints about everything from excessive chicken noise to intimidating vegetable displays. Without realizing it, she was building the state's case against herself. Her worst blunder came when she tried to bribe County Building Inspector Bob Martinez into declaring my barn unsafe. Bob had inspected that structure twice in the past 5 years and knew it was rock solid. When Karen slid an envelope across the table at a coffee shop, he called the sheriff immediately. "She offered me to grant cash to invent violations that don't exist," Bob reported. "I've met some desperate folks, but this woman's out of her mind." That bribe gave us Karen's first chargeable felony, but Sarah, my prosecutor friend, urged patience. "Don't push for an arrest yet," she advised. "The more rope she has, the more evidence she'll hand us. Desperation always breeds bigger mistakes." And she was right. The community response had grown beyond anything I imagined. Local veterans started organizing weekend rallies at the farm, encouraging families to stop by, buy produce, and stand against bullying. The county fair committee even asked me to give a speech about protecting agricultural heritage in the face of development. Word spread to 3 neighboring counties, where landowners reported almost identical harassment, turning my fight into a regional push for rural property rights. Then Karen made the move that sealed her fate. Convinced she was losing control, she began spreading wild rumors that I was running drugs out of my farm stand. She even filed false police reports claiming she'd witnessed shady vehicles making late-night package exchanges. In reality, she was describing working folks buying vegetables after their shifts, but her claims carried enough weight to trigger a de-inquiry. When federal agents arrived, they expected to uncover a hidden operation. What they actually found was an off-duty deputy raising chickens and growing heirloom tomatoes. What they didn't expect was a neatly organized file full of evidence documenting years of systematic harassment and multiple false reports from Karen herself. The lead agent, Detective Riley, flipped through my paperwork, then looked me straight in the eye. "Deputy, what you've got here for federal fraud charges. This isn't neighborly bickering anymore, it's organized criminal activity." That night, as I sat on the porch with Buttercup lazily chewing grass beside me, the reality sank in. Karen had gone beyond petty harassment. She was now deep in federal crime territory. The cool evening breeze mixed with the smell of ripening tomatoes, and for the first time in months, I felt like freedom was finally within reach. Her pricey attorney was already backing away from her wildest schemes, and even Braden was quietly making phone calls, clearly trying to contain the fallout. But Karen couldn't admit defeat. She was too far gone, plotting her last desperate maneuver. I could see it in her stare from across the property line like a general preparing for one final battle she had no hope of winning. 3 months into this ordeal, I stumbled onto the revelation that turned the whole case upside down. While combing through the county law library for whole case precedents, something kept nagging at me. Why hadn't Karen's lawyer ever produced the original incorporation papers during the lawsuit? Any legitimate HOA should have those documents at the ready. So, I filed a request for Willowbrook Estate's complete history with the state, asking for every record Montana law required. When I opened that dusty government folder, my hands actually shook. Karen Pitton had never legally formed an HOA at all, not even close. Instead of certified incorporation papers, state registration numbers, insurance bonds, and required financial oversight records. The file contained little more than meeting minutes and a photocopied template from some random website. For 5 years, Karen had been collecting dues and issuing fines through what amounted to nothing more than a neighborhood club pretending to be an HOA. But the real explosion came when the DA's office subpoenaed the financials. Every single dollar of HOA dues over $300,000 was sitting in a personal checking account labeled K. Pitton, Administrator. No business account, no board, no audits, just Karen's private slush fund. Fueled by her neighbor's monthly payments, the bank statements read like exhibits in a fraud trial. A luxury European vacation disguised as an whole conference, BMW car payments marked down as administrative costs, a pool renovation billed as a community improvement project. Karen had been treating whole funds as her personal credit card for half a decade, never imagining anyone would look closely enough to realize she had no legal authority in the first place. Sitting there with the evidence spread out before me, it all became clear. Every false police call, every complaint, every attempt to bury me under fines and lawsuits, it had all been Karen's frantic effort to keep this truth hidden. This was never about aesthetics or property values. It was about concealing a fraudulent empire that had been financing her lifestyle from day one. And now the consequences were undeniable. Running a fake corporation while collecting money under false pretenses wasn't just shady, it carried heavy federal charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. Karen wasn't looking at fines or community service anymore. She was staring down the very real possibility of prison, and the IRS. The financial consequences alone were enough to wipe out her family, even if no criminal charges were filed. And here's the delicious irony: every single resident of Willowbrook had the right to demand full repayment of the money they'd ever handed over, because they'd been victims of a carefully orchestrated scam. Every fine Karen imposed was bogus. Every assessment notice she issued had no legal foundation. What she had been running wasn't community management, it was a protection racket dressed up in suburban respectability. When I called Sarah at the prosecutor's office, her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. "Ezra, this is like Christmas morning for a prosecutor. We've got 5 years of documented fraud, with a paper trail that goes directly into Karen's personal bank account." She was so certain of her authority, she never even bothered to make it legitimate. That revelation also explained Braden's growing unease. He knew his wife was sitting on a financial time bomb that could level everything they had built: the construction firm, their political clout, their lavish lifestyle. It all depended on Karen's fake whole machine running smoothly, with nobody pulling back the curtain. Now it was clear why she had escalated things so ruthlessly. She couldn't back down. Backing down meant financial ruin, and very likely, federal prison. The satisfaction of justice was sweet, but I knew we were just getting started. Karen was about to learn a hard truth: you can't build an empire on lies. Eventually, it all collapses, and when it does, it drags everything down with it. The next morning, I walked into District Attorney Sarah Hawthorne's office carrying 5 boxes of evidence and a plan that would flip Karen's world upside down. Sarah spread the documents across her conference table, shaking her head at the bank statements that showed Karen funding her luxury lifestyle with money squeezed out of her neighbors. "Ezra, this isn't harassment anymore. This is a criminal enterprise masquerading as neighborhood management." The list of charges stacked up like groceries on a conveyor belt: embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, attempted bribery, tax evasion. And because she'd used both the mail and electronic transfers to collect her bogus fees. We could tack on federal wire fraud and mail fraud felonies carrying real prison time. The irony, Sarah pointed out, was that Karen had done the work for us. Most criminals try to cover their tracks. Karen practically put hers on display. But charges weren't enough. We needed a strategy that would expose her crimes publicly while safeguarding the community she'd been bleeding dry. That's when I remembered a lesson from my patrol days. The best way to catch a criminal is to let them believe they're winning, right up until the cuff snap shut. The legal groundwork was solid. Montana's one-party consent law meant every recorded conversation with Karen was admissible. State statutes on corporate fraud required full restitution to victims, and the stolen money was still sitting in her personal account like a loaded gun. Most importantly, since she had never legally incorporated the whole, every official action she'd taken over 5 years was fraudulent on its face. The legal groundwork was solid. Montana's one-party consent law meant every recorded conversation with Karen was admissible. State statutes on corporate fraud required full restitution to victims, and the stolen money was still sitting in her personal account like a loaded gun. Most importantly, since she had never legally incorporated the whole, every official action she'd taken over 5 years was fraudulent on its face. I began quietly rallying community support. One of my first allies was Judge Patricia Morrison, recently retired and living near Willowbrook. She'd been observing Karen's antics with a professional eye, and when I approached her, she leaned forward and said, "Ezra," over coffee. She looked at me and said, "Ezra, I've prosecuted mob cases with less evidence than what this woman left behind." She was so convinced of her own power, she never realized she didn't actually have any. The veterans who had rallied around my farm became my evidence team. Together, we sorted through 5 years of financial records, correspondence, and witness statements, assembling a case file that any federal prosecutor would be eager to take on. My friend Mike from the sheriff's office coordinated with state investigators who had already been tracking similar fraud schemes across Montana. But here's where the plan got clever. Instead of moving in for an immediate arrest, we chose to let Karen keep operating. "She doesn't know we've uncovered the financial fraud," Sarah explained. "Every single day she runs her fake hole, she racks up more charges. Every letter, every threat, every fine, it all adds weight to the indictment." The residents of Willowbrook were also waking up to the truth. Once they learned they had no obligation to pay dues to an unregistered organization, 43 households stopped paying instantly. Even better, they realized they could demand refunds of everything they'd ever paid. Funds that were still sitting in Karen's personal account. The timing had to be precise. Karen had called what she dubbed a mandatory emergency meeting, intending to roll out new fines and stricter enforcement measures. She mailed out intimidating notices complete with phony letterhead and hollow threats of legal action. The irony couldn't have been sharper. She was breaking the law while gearing up to accuse me of it. I reached out to the local press, and Channel 7's investigative team jumped at the chance to cover the spectacle. "If we play this right," reporter Jeanne Wolf said, "her sham meeting becomes her public confession broadcast live." The psychological edge was everything. Karen still thought she was on top. Her pricey lawyer had already backed out, but she strutted ahead, representing herself with the misplaced confidence of someone who believed loud words and official-looking documents equaled authority. She even promoted the meeting as her final solution to the agricultural problem, promising so-called shocking evidence of my corruption. My last preparations were simple but critical. Backup deputies would be stationed around the community center, not to guard me, but to make sure Karen couldn't slip away once the truth landed. Detective Riley from the State Fraud Division would be there, federal warrants in hand. Well, the bank had already frozen Karen's accounts in anticipation. The trap was perfect precisely because Karen had built it herself. She scheduled a sham meeting to prove authority she never had, threatening neighbors with laws that didn't exist while federal investigators stood ready to capture every fraudulent word. Sometimes justice isn't about striking back. It's about letting someone hand you the rope and then watching them tie the noose themselves. That evening, as I sat on my porch with Buttercup grazing nearby, I felt something I hadn't in months come. The scent of ripening tomatoes drifted through the mountain air, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I could sense the end was near. Karen Fitton was about to face the toughest lesson of her privileged life. Real authority can't be faked, and stolen money always has to be paid back. Her carefully built world was crumbling, and desperation was driving her to reckless extremes. With most of Willowbrook's residents refusing to pay dues and her control evaporating, Karen decided to strike directly at what she believed was the source of her troubles: my farm. At first, the escalation seemed almost laughable. My security cameras caught her at 2:30 in the morning, dressed head to toe in dark clothes, fumbling with a crowbar at my irrigation system. She spent nearly 20 minutes wrestling with a water valve she clearly didn't understand before giving up and settling for unscrewing the caps on my fertilizer containers, dumping nutrients haphazardly on the crops. The irony: her sabotage only enriched the soil and helped my vegetables thrive. But her desperation soon pushed her into more serious territory. A week later, she attempted to ruin my organic certification by spraying commercial herbicide near my crop rows, hoping inspectors would find chemical residue and revoke my license. What she hadn't considered was picking the windiest day of the month for her stunt. The majority of the spray blew back onto her immaculate lawns, leaving my carefully maintained gardens mostly untouched. My cameras even caught her hasty retreat once she realized she'd just poisoned her own grass. The real danger came when she escalated to filing a new wave of false police reports. These were far more serious than her earlier complaints. Karen began calling 911, claiming she had witnessed drug deals taking place at my farm stand, misrepresenting ordinary vegetable sales as suspicious package exchanges. She submitted elaborate reports describing late-night criminal activity with unmarked vehicles and supposed cash handoffs, essentially criminalizing families who stopped by after work to buy produce. Those fabrications triggered a investigation that could have ended my law enforcement career. When federal agents arrived, they were prepared to uncover a drug ring. Instead, they found an off-duty deputy tending tomato plants. They were not amused. Agent Sarah Martinez reviewed Karen's 17 false reports, spread across 5 different agencies, and shook her head. "Deputy Blackwood, this isn't neighbor harassment anymore. This is systematic obstruction of justice and we'll be adding federal charges." Karen's spiral hit its peak when she attempted to bribe County Building Inspector Bob Martinez to condemn my barn as unsafe. She met him at Murphy's Diner, sliding an envelope with $2,000 across the table, insisting my barn posed an imminent safety hazard requiring immediate action. But Bob, a 30-year veteran, who had inspected that barn twice before and knew it was structurally sound, so he wasted no time reporting the bribery attempt. "She wanted me to invent violations," he told my captain. "That's not just corruption, that's asking me to endanger lives for her personal vendetta." The attempt gave us exactly what we'd been waiting for: felony backed by evidence and eyewitness testimony. Sarah at the DA's office was ready to press charges, but I urged her to hold off. "She's digging her own grave faster than we can fill it," I argued. "Every desperate stunt just adds years to her sentence." The community, meanwhile, was watching her unravel. Karen began confronting customers at my farm stand, shouting about property values and accusing them of aiding criminal activity. When she cornered elderly Mrs. Bennett, who was simply buying tomatoes for her grandkids, witnesses immediately reported it as harassment. Mrs. Bennett, a retired federal employee who had dealt with real criminals, told Karen flatly that she was humiliating herself and making life miserable for her neighbors. Her behavior spread beyond my farm. After she berated a teenage grocery clerk for stocking my produce, local businesses quietly began shutting their doors to her. The downtown coffee shop even posted a polite but pointed sign: "We support all local agriculture and ask customers to treat one another respectfully." The message was clear: Karen wasn't welcome if she couldn't act like a decent human being. Her online presence painted an even clearer picture of collapse. Posts grew increasingly paranoid, portraying my quiet farm as a hub of suspicious activity threatening community safety. She uploaded grainy photos taken from her bathroom window, trying to make ordinary chores look sinister. The posts went viral, but not the way she wanted. People shared them as examples of HOA abuse and unchecked power, not as support for her cause. The breaking point came when she publicly called on concerned citizens to help her run surveillance operations on my farm. She urged followers to bring cameras and whatever else might be necessary to document the so-called threat I posed. The sheriff's department treated this as a potential safety risk and temporarily seized her firearms while she underwent a mental health evaluation. By the fourth month, Karen had gone from nuisance neighbor to full-blown federal criminal. Producing enough evidence to prosecute a dozen people, her obsession had carried her far past petty disputes into felony territory, all while I kept documenting every step. The crisp mountain air tasted like justice as I watched her destroy herself, one false report at a time. Her final month before collapse was the most frantic yet. With Willowbrook residents refusing to pay dues and federal investigators circling her finances, she launched what she called her evidence-gathering campaign to finally prove that I was the real criminal. Her first move was hiring a private investigator, Marcus Webb, to conduct professional surveillance of my farm. She paid him $5,000, convinced he'd uncover the crimes she'd been ranting about. Webb spent 3 days observing my operation, then contacted the sheriff. Deputy Blackwood, he told my captain, this woman paid me to find crimes that don't exist. When I told her your farm was completely legal, she offered me another $5,000 to invent evidence. The attempt to bribe a licensed investigator added yet another felony to her growing list. But it also revealed something important: Karen was running out of money. Later, bank records showed she had drained her retirement savings and even borrowed against her house to fuel her personal war against my farm. The same woman who had once lived lavishly off stolen HOA funds was now bankrupting herself. Karen had turned her fury inward, intent on destroying the one person who had exposed her corruption. Her desperation pushed her toward bolder tactics. She began mailing certified letters to my regular customers, warning them that buying from my farm made them accomplices in criminal activity and threatening to report them to the authorities. The letters, dressed up with her counterfeit HOA letterhead and sprinkled with pseudo-legal jargon about community safety protocols and mandatory reporting, carried the illusion of officialdom. What she didn't grasp was that attempting to intimidate witnesses in an active federal case is itself a felony. Instead of frightening anyone, her letters had the opposite effect. They united people. Mrs. Patterson, never one to stay quiet, organized what she proudly called a Freedom to Buy Vegetables rally. At my farm stand, 30 neighbors showed up in solidarity. This woman thinks she can dictate where we shop, Mrs. Patterson declared. I've been buying tomatoes longer than she's been alive. And I'll be damned if some self-appointed HOA tyrant tells me where to spend my money. Karen's next move was a sprawling complaint to the state agriculture department. She accused my farm of violating organic standards and causing environmental damage, backing it with a 40-page dossier. Her so-called evidence included soil samples she'd stolen while trespassing and photos from her late-night surveillance. The inspector assigned to the case later admitted it was the most elaborate case of personal harassment disguised as environmental concern he had seen in 20 years. The outcome couldn't have been better. My farm was cleared of all wrongdoing, and I was even recommended for the state's Sustainable Agriculture Excellence Award. Ironically, the very soil samples Karen had swiped proved my practices exceeded certification requirements. Once again, her evidence became my vindication, and the inspector's report became another exhibit for prosecutors. When official channels failed, Karen grew even more erratic. She tried to rally neighboring HOA letters into what she dramatically called a regional agricultural resistance coalition. She sent messages to HOA presidents in 3 different counties, warning that my farm represented a dangerous precedent that needed coordinated opposition before other agricultural invasions spread. Every single one of those presidents forwarded her communications to law enforcement, marking them as possible evidence of conspiracy to harass rural property owners. But while Karen's self-destructs accelerated, something incredible was happening around my farm. Her harassment campaign unintentionally sparked a regional movement in support of agricultural rights. Families began traveling from all over Montana to shop at my stand, not just for produce, but to stand behind someone who had refused to bow to petty tyranny: veterans, small business owners, and rural families with their own stories of being pushed around turned my farm into a weekend gathering spot. The media attention grew right alongside the support. Local newspapers began publishing weekly updates on what they now called the HOA farm fight. Channel 7's investigative team started documenting Karen's antics as a case study in Unchecked. Neighborhood Power, clips of her sitting in her BMW, barking at customers through rolled-down windows while conducting surveillance, went viral across social media. Finally, even her high-priced attorney had enough and withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences and client behavior that made professional representation impossible. Forced to represent herself, Karen filed increasingly bizarre motions demanding emergency injunctions and federal action against what she described as agricultural terrorism in suburban neighborhoods. Judge Morrison later described her filings as legally incoherent and professionally embarrassing. By the close of the 5th month, Karen had gone from irritating neighbor to federal defendant while at the same time fueling a statewide movement to protect rural landowners. Her desperation had carried her past the point of no return. Karen had already created enough evidence to support multiple felony charges. The Mountaineer seemed to carry the scent of long-awaited justice as her final reckoning drew near. The Willowbrook Community Center buzzed with unease as residents filed in for what Karen had declared a mandatory emergency meeting. She had threatened legal action against anyone who failed to attend her presentation of supposed evidence against my farm. More than 80 people filled the room: neighbors, reporters, and several strangers who would later reveal themselves to be federal investigators. The smell of coffee mixed with tension as Karen arranged her materials like a lawyer about to prosecute the case of a lifetime. I entered quietly, dressed in full uniform, my badge reflecting under the fluorescent lights, and took a seat at the back. When Karen noticed me, her eyes gleamed with what she believed was victory. She had set up poster boards plastered with photographs, spreadsheets, and manila folders stuffed with what she proclaimed was undeniable proof of conspiracy. A hired cameraman adjusted his tripod, ready to record what she imagined would be her crowning moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began in that familiar haughty tone, "tonight we expose the agricultural terrorism poisoning our community like a disease. For too long, corrupt law enforcement has shielded these criminal elements. For the next 20 minutes, she presented her so-called evidence with the certainty of someone completely detached from reality. She showed grainy photos of families purchasing tomatoes, insisting they were coded drug exchanges. She played audio clips of everyday conversations at my farm stand, claiming they were encrypted communications in agricultural code. She even waved around my legitimate farm income statements, calling them proof of money laundering. As her slideshow dragged on, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances as it dawned on them that Karen had been obsessively spying on their every visit to my stand, like a one-woman secret police unit in a gated suburb. Finally, she reached what she called her smoking gun. With dramatic flair, she pointed at me. "Deputy Ezra Blackwood has exploited his badge to protect his criminal empire while intimidating good citizens who dare to speak truth to power. I have documented 17 cases of police corruption and abuse of authority." Karen spun to face the crowd, arms raised as though rallying troops. "I call on this community to make a citizen's arrest of this corrupt deputy sheriff who has betrayed his oath and terrorized our neighborhood." The room went silent. Not a single person moved. Several residents looked at the floor, embarrassed for her. The weight of her delusion was undeniable. That's when I rose from my chair and walked slowly to the front, my boots echoing in the stillness. "Good evening, everyone," I said evenly, my voice carrying the steadiness of 15 years in law enforcement. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Ezra Blackwood, and I believe Miss Pitton has been expecting me." Karen's smug expression faltered as confusion crept in. I continued, "Miss Pitton, you've just given us a perfect demonstration of why you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, and operating an illegal organization." I produced the arrest warrant. Her face twisted from Disbelief into terror as I read her rights. Karen Pitton, you have the right to remain silent. The crowd gasped, whispers rippling through the room as I reached for the handcuffs. Karen shrieked, her voice cracking, "This is impossible. I'm the victim here. I have authority to run this hoa. You can't arrest me." "Actually, ma'am, you never had any authority," I replied, snapping the cuffs onto her wrists. "Your HOA was never legally incorporated. Every dollar collected, every fine issued, every document you drafted fraudulent." At that moment, Detective Riley from the State Fraud Division stepped forward, holding federal warrants. "Mrs. Pitton, you are also under federal arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, and tax evasion. Over $300,000 stolen from your neighbors." Karen's public unraveling was complete. She screamed about conspiracies, corruption, and property values as her own cameraman captured every second of her breakdown. "This is a setup. You're all part of the plot." I was protecting the neighborhood. The crowd's reaction was immediate and cathartic. Applause broke out, and Mrs. Patterson stood up to declare, "That woman has terrorized this neighborhood for 5 years. Today, justice finally caught up with her." But the bigger shock came when Detective Riley addressed the residents directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, each of you has been the victim of systematic fraud. Every single whole payment you made ended up in Ms. Pitton's personal account. You are all entitled to full restitution, plus damages." As Karen was led out in handcuffs, her cries of innocence echoing through the parking lot, the taste of justice felt sweeter than my grandmother's apple pie. Local media broadcast her perp walk live, and households across Montana who had been following the story saw her downfall unfold in real time. When the community center finally emptied, neighbors stayed behind to shake my hand and share their own stories of being harassed by Karen. Outside, the mountain air smelled like pure freedom. 6 months later, justice tasted even better than I could have imagined. Karen Pitton was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, ordered to pay $400,000 in restitution, and given 500 hours of community service, ironically assigned to organic farms so she could gain an appreciation for what she had spent years trying to destroy. The poetic nature of the sentence wasn't lost on anyone, especially after her lawyer argued that farm work was cruel and unusual punishment. Even the bailiffs had to hide their smiles. Residents of Willowbrook were reimbursed an average of $8,000 each, money that changed lives in meaningful ways. Families put it toward college funds, long-delayed vacations, and long overdue home improvements. A legitimate whole was created with proper incorporation, full transparency, and, by unanimous vote, a permanent bylaw safeguarding agricultural operations. At long last, real democracy had come to Willowbrook Estates. My farm also transformed into something I'd never imagined. What began as a quiet refuge to recover from my divorce grew into a thriving community hub that connected rural families with city dwellers. The farm stand expanded into a cooperative featuring products from nearby farms, creating a market that supported multiple families while educating people about where their food comes from. The annual Blackwood Harvest Festival soon became the county's most celebrated event. Thousands came each year to sample local products, learn about sustainable farming, and let their kids experience agriculture firsthand. Our very first festival raised $25,000 in scholarships for rural students pursuing degrees in agricultural science and sustainability. Personal happiness found me as well. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the veterinarian who first stopped by during the height of Karen's harassment, became my partner in every sense of the word. Her expertise with livestock and her infectious laughter reshaped both the farm and my daily life. We're planning a spring wedding beneath the apple trees Karen once wanted torn down. The ripple effects of our case reshaped property law in Montana. The legislature passed the Rural Property Protection Act, requiring HOA transparency, proper incorporation, and exemptions for agricultural land. Within a year, 3 other states adopted similar laws after advocacy groups used our case as a blueprint for stopping neighborhood overreach. Ironically, Karen's crimes ended up protecting thousands of farmers she'd never meet. But the most meaningful change happened in Willowbrook itself. Without Karen's manufactured chaos, people discovered they actually enjoyed one another's company. Property values rose as the community became known for cooperation instead of conflict. Block parties replaced angry board meetings, shared gardens replaced petty disputes, and problem-solving became collaborative rather than authoritarian. Even Braden Pitton managed to rebuild his reputation after a public apology and restitution to victims of their past harassment. He refocused his construction company on farm-friendly development that preserved agricultural land instead of destroying it. His business flourished by promoting rural charm without sacrificing rural livelihoods. The Montana Public Television documentary about our case sparked national conversations about hoe reform. Viewer response led to follow-up documentaries featuring other victims of harassment who found the courage to fight back after seeing our story. Karen's collapse had ignited a movement that protected property owners across the country. Now, as I sit here writing with Buttercup grazing in the evening sun and the smell of Sarah's fresh bread drifting from the kitchen, I'm grateful. Every step of Karen's campaign against me ended up giving me the life I didn't know I needed. Deep community connections, meaningful work, lasting love, and the pride of standing up to bullies wherever they appear. The mountain air now carries the scent of ripening harvests and the joyful sounds of children playing during our educational programs. Sometimes the best revenge isn't payback, it's creating something so good that it lifts up everyone around you. Karen taught me something important. Bullies always reveal their weakness through their desperate need to control others, but she also showed me that ordinary people have extraordinary strength when they refuse to be silenced by fake authority and empty threats. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's your whole horror story? Drop a comment below and share your encounters with neighborhood tyrants who thought they could push you around. You might be surprised how many rights you truly have and how many people will stand with you. And if you enjoyed watching Karen finally get what she deserved, don't forget to subscribe to Karen's Stories for more tales of entitled neighbors meeting their match. Trust me, the California ranch case I'm covering next makes Karen look like an amateur. Thanks for tuning into HOA Stories, where neighbors fight back against HOA bullies and karma always comes knocking. If you like this story, hit the like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real-life neighborhood drama every week.